Hello and welcome to Lucky episode 60 of the Chills of Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by the talented writer Andrew Liu. Andrew Liu is a 2020 MFA graduate of CSU Long Beach's Creative Writing Poetry program. He's published in two student magazines, East Los Angeles City College's Milestone and CSU Long Beach's Rip Rap. You can read his MFA thesis called California Metaphysics, which collects some of his best poems on CSULB's thesis database. And I will definitely link that in the show notes. But again, that's the CSU Long Beach thesis database. You can read California Metaphysics. You can also view a recording of a virtual reading of selected poems organized by Andrew Liu and his friend Jesse Tovar on YouTube. And again, I will publish that on the series notes, on the episode notes, excuse me. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. How'd I do
It's
on
a
the
pleasure to
intro?
be here.
Oh man, it's great
Um,
great to have you. Anything else that you'd like to add about your bio?
no, that's about everything. I'm actually like very much still an amateur. I'm not like really professionally published anywhere, except for perhaps some of the things I've done in school.
I'm going to go ahead and disagree with you because your work is really incredible. So it's cool to get you on the way up. You know what I mean? Because I know that you got bigger and better things ahead of you. You're
Well,
quite
thank you.
Oh, no doubt about it. You're quite a writer, and one of the things that we were talking about before we started recording was, it's really cool to read the thesis and to read the rationale, the imagery or the description behind why you wrote what you did without giving things away. I know there's a fine line for a writer with that, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But so you grew up in San Gabriel Valley area in Rosemead, is that correct?
Yeah.
What was it like growing up as far as language, and was it a print rich environment? Did you speak only English at home, or are you multilingual or bilingual? How did
Well,
literature and language work when you were a kid?
I think for one, like I had a pretty normal childhood. That's fairly typical of a lot of kids growing up in the San Gabriel Valley. Like
Mhm.
a lot of the times, like when you're like the child of immigrant parents, you learn the mother tongue first, and for me that was Chinese.
Mm.
And at the beginning, I was really able to speak fairly fluently. At least that's how it felt, because
Hmm.
through the lens of my childhood memories, I felt like I could complete my sentences. I could address people without that many problems.
Hmm.
I mean, it was difficult because, like, as I grew up, so much of the schoolwork became more centered around mastery of English. And so gradually, my English far outpaced my Chinese to the
Sure.
point where it naturally just became a sort of like broken language for me because
Hmm.
despite years of being in Chinese school, my English was just, it was it would gradually replace Chinese as my natural language.
Hmm.
And so for me, I've always had a sort of like contentious relation with like these two languages.
Hmm.
One which was kind of belonging to a culture that was far removed from me in terms of my everyday, and another that while I knew at some like part kind of had a place in colonization and history and
Sure.
just the whole process of like cultural domination, I still kind of loved English. You know,
Hmm.
English was one of my favorite classes as a child, as a student. And in high school, that's where I really learned to become a poet, especially with the help of my teacher, Miss Burkhardt. Um, she was the one who encouraged me to attend poetry reading events and to write my own poetry.
Wow.
And through my membership in the writing club at school,
Hmm.
YAWP, Young Aspiring Writers Program, it was there that I kind of learned to foster and develop my ability to write.
Wow. Yeah. Shout out to Miss Burkhardt. That's awesome. Would have been Mandarin or Cantonese that you grew up with then?
Well, I'm actually Taiwanese by birth, so both my parents came from Taiwan and then they immigrated here. I was born in like a Garfield hospital, so that makes me like a not a naturalized citizen, but a citizen by birth. Um, and I never really learned a lot of Taiwanese because
Hmm.
it's actually a separate dialect
Okay.
from Chinese. Chinese, it uses the same orthographic system, so the same Chinese characters, but the pronunciation and the origin of sound comes from a completely different place.
Wow.
And you'll find that if you study Chinese and its multiple dialects, everything from Cantonese to Hakkanese, all across Asia, there are these different branches of Chinese that are not, really Chinese. They're
Hmm.
completely different languages. They just share a similar orthographic system. And
Sure.
so the history of Chinese is actually a history of the mandarins, the bureaucrats who worked in the imperial court,
Uh,
their development of the writing system, what we know today as the modern Chinese character system,
mhm.
and their distribution of that writing system in an attempt to culturally subjugate and dominate all the indigenous peoples across what is today considered, modern China.
Huh.
And so much of modern Chinese, just like English in a way, is a history of cultural and linguistic domination.
Right. Wow, that really does come back to that little, maxim that, language is power, not in the way that a lot of people mean it. They mean that in the positive way.
Yeah.
Right. Language is political, all of those things. That's very interesting. You talk about it being forced upon people by the bureaucracy. Have you seen then like looking at the other dialects then as much as unequal, as lesser than, or is that maybe changed in a positive way over the recent years?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say, and I'm not exactly a linguistics expert myself, but from what I do know about the sort of like culture and history and the contention,
Hmm.
especially political, between Taiwan and China, is that
Right.
a lot of people in Taiwan are able to speak the Taiwanese dialect. That's the
Hmm.
majority sort of like language. But at the
Hmm.
same time, it's not sort of registered or recognized as,
Sure.
a national language. It's
Mm.
just the language that people speak. So if
Okay.
a politician wants to be successful in Taiwan, they should be fluent in both Mandarin Chinese and in the Taiwanese dialect.
Hmm.
And yet at the same time, it's also slowly declining in speakers. So the rates
Hmm.
of people who are actually fluent in Taiwanese are, actually declining. And Taiwan has an incredibly contentious relationship with
Sure.
China due to the political, history that originated back in like World War II, the separation of Chiang Kai-shek from the Communist Party and his subsequent fleeing to Taiwan.
Huh.
And so there's just a lot of history and political controversy there. And language is one of the stages in which all this politics plays out. And so, people, the poets, individuals, the people who inhabit our poetry, they're all sort of like characters who are influenced and,
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
they have to accept the sort of like influences that these conflicts play out with.
Language is a stage upon which these play out. I'm going to steal that from my next poem. Is that cool? I'll give you credit
Yeah.
though. I'll give you credit. Don't worry. um,
All writing is collaborative.
there you go. Right. You talk about how your speaking Taiwanese had really kind of not disappeared, but has faded. Do you see any remnants? Do you hear any remnants in what you write today, or do you feel like that's so distant? You talk a lot about dichotomy and you do a lot of juxtaposition in your poetry, and the tension that comes between opposites. You know, very very dissimilar languages, right? As far as like pronunciation, the alphabet and such. I wonder if you can trace any remnants from that original language.
I think in terms of like what I like to use in terms of poetic devices and
Mm-hmm.
the sort of linguistic history I have,
Mm.
it's less to do with the difference between the synographic versus the Western languages, and it has more to do with the separation between the adult and the child. Because
Okay.
while I was certainly aware of the distinctions between like English and Chinese and
Mm.
Taiwanese was never a language, a dialect that I was fluent in. It was always
Sure.
my mother and father's language. It was always the language of my surrounding family, the older people
Mm-hmm.
of my family. And so I was never fluent in it. I can recognize the cadence, I can recognize the tones that they use, but I
Mm-hmm.
never understood the language. And this was in direct contrast with both Chinese and English. Chinese, I never really developed a complete understanding of. Like, never truly learned to read or write it, other than what was outside of the second language classes that I took all the way from elementary school to college. And so it was English, which I had a truly complete, or, the illusion, an illusory completeness of.
Mm.
So when I consider the relationship that I have with these three separate languages and the subordination of one language to another, it really just is a reflection of my current understanding of how language works as like an oppressive medium, as a carrier and an inheritor of oppression and history.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of my poetic devices and the things that I like to use in poetry, it's really media and culture and art that really influences the way that I write. Like, for example, I always started off with an attraction to imagery,
Mm-hmm.
especially natural imagery, especially flowers. And I think that probably emerges as a result of my queer identity. Like, because I'm gay, I always really liked flowers. Because I always really liked flowers, I got more into, you know, images of the erotic, images of eroticism. And so much of my childhood was kind of focused on girly stuff, on girls' media, shoujo manga, but
Mm.
also because of the male privilege that I was born with, it also enabled me to access things that were traditionally considered for boys, things like video games, things like
Mm.
shonen manga. And so all of this media sort of created a confluence where I knew what I wanted, like I knew what I liked. And
Mm.
so developing all of that in like my childhood, in my teenage years, learning about manga, learning about anime, learning about cartoons, learning about animation, learning about all these different things and all these different types of media. But of course, also bringing in Sylvia Plath, who was one of my first
Mm.
the poets that I really fell in love with, and bringing in the more classical sort of authors like Emily Dickinson.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I really began to feel like poetry was something that I had a voice in and that I could inhabit.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Let's connect the dots a little bit. You talked about Miss Burkhardt, 12th grade English, and some of those great programs. YOP, I think you said it was called, right?
Yeah.
Who, in those intervening years, who were you reading? What were you reading? You talked a little bit about anime, of course, and Plath and some of them. Who were those? The name of the podcast is the Chills at Will podcast. It's this idea about those thrilling authors, writers, poets of all types, those people who gave you chills at will, who you could almost memorize and repeat upon command.
I
How was
actually was like taught to memorize poems
huh?
like in my 10th and 11th and 12th grade because they were for school assignments. But unlike a lot of students, I feel I really like memorizing or
Hmm.
being forced to recite these poems because I got to choose the poems that I like.
Sure.
And so one of the first poets that I really admired was Edgar Lee Masters, who wrote the Spoon
Okay.
River anthology, and he's one of the lesser known modernists, so probably one of the earliest precursors. Like I
Mm.
myself never even learned about the history of him other than like a cursory overview until like I went and did a Wikipedia search,
Hmm.
and there he was with most of his history. And he's often been kind of like left to the side as like one of the early pioneers of modernism. And he
Mm-hmm.
was never as flashy as T.S. Eliot or E. Cummings. But for me, what he did differently was that he took the formal, sort of restrained verse that we as Americans inherited from Edwardian culture back in Britain, and he turned it towards the small town lives and experiences
Mm.
of the places that he grew up in, that he still lived in. And so all of his speakers in the Spoon River anthology are dead. And all of the poems in that anthology are speaking from a place beyond death.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me is the central motif or conceit that really attracted me to Edgar Lee Masters. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't necessarily that, his place in history or all that. I was not interested in that as a
Sure.
child, as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in being able to access information, being able to access a voice,
Mm-hmm.
consciousness, and experience, even beyond death, which was supposed to be this final place and a place of oblivion. And instead, through poetry, he was able to make the dead speak. He was able to make them come back to life in a certain way. And I was always attracted to that. Even in the cartoons I would watch, even in the anime and the media that I would consume, I was always kind of like looking for this pattern of resurrection, this pattern of being able to speak beyond death.
Mm-hmm.
And partly I felt it emerged because I wanted to be able to have a voice even beyond death.
Mm-hmm.
Because like the death that I felt like so close to me, even when I was a child, even when I was a teenager, was a sort of erasure of identity. Like for me, that death that I was always trying to speak out of was a death of identity where I would no longer be myself. Like so much of the influences that I had on my poetry, everyone from Sylvia Plath at 3D Masters, is because I was afraid of losing who I was, of no longer having an identity. And it's because of that I really gravitated towards poetry, because I wanted that ability to have a voice even when silenced.
Wow. Beautifully put, and quite an elegy for Masters. Well, is Masters with an S? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I've definitely heard of them. I definitely need to take a deeper dive into the reading. You talk about a lot of your imagination, being yourself. What I really appreciate about your poetry is that you do have, and you say it yourself in the thesis explanation, you have a mix of the high and the low, high culture, if we will, low culture, classics, more modern. From the thesis, you write, I am a greedy reader, but an even more gluttonous dreamer. I devour and internalize anything I find interesting in the world of my thoughts. In that sense, for me, there is no real difference between the academic and the personal. When did you, like, I understand obviously the idea of being having such a vivid imagination as a kid and being a dreamer. When did you realize, like, hey, I can do this at the academic level too? You know what I mean?
Um,
I can follow form, but I can also expand the form.
a lot of that kind of emerged naturally and intuitively past the 11th grade, because I was forcing myself to take as many AP classes as I could stomach, because
Sure.
that's what a good Asian student is supposed to do. And so following the practices of the model minority, I was preparing myself for colleges that I wouldn't be able to get into because of my D's in Algebra 2. Like that's the
Stupid
reason
algebra
why.
two. Stupid
Yeah.
algebra two. I hear you. I hear you.
I would not be able to get into a 4-year university except through a community college. And through the process of failing in math and having to go to a community college, I kind of like just, I opened up to myself as a student. I was able to realize that it wasn't because I was a bad student. It wasn't because that I was stupid that I was doing that or having poor grades. It was because so much of our learning experience, especially with like K through 12, is because a lot of the things that we have to do, we don't get a choice in. You have to attend school. You have to go to class on time. You have to do these assignments. You have to turn them in. They have to be complete. And it's because of that that I found community college exceptionally freeing, because I had taken all these AP classes, and so I was kind of overqualified, and I tested out of English 101. And that landed me straight into like the pits of the survey literature classes. And I would kind of get a small shock for my life, because while my writing skills were on par, the sort of framework and theoretical expectations that are, brought forward when you have to attend a lit survey class are different from an AP class.
Sure.
In an AP class, it was all group projects and essays. But in the lit survey classes, a lot of it was like read on your own, write on your own, do the class discussions, really pay attention and try to engage with the class. And it was a different sort of like model and a different context for the skills that I've been practicing. Like I never really realized how bad I was at essays until I got the sort of like feedback from my teacher, who she was really wonderful. She was strict, but in a sort of loving way. Like she wanted her students to succeed, and she wanted to see them do the best that they did. And so she would grade accordingly. And she would never hesitate to tell me when, something was weak or when my arguments were off. And so by learning to sort of like acclimatize to what a lot of people traditionally view as the academic language of mastery, I
Mm-hmm.
found that I was able to have a voice in that as well. And so a lot of the time, I feel like my development as a writer is kind of unusual because I did kind of love the language of whiteness. I did kind of love the language of the master, the oppressor. And I did not realize, like a lot of people, sort of like oppressive history behind these types of things, behind the English language. And in coming to love them and see all the good and the beauty inside of them, it made me want to like not assimilate, but to critique it and to negotiate with it and to remediate like the oppressive and the racist parts of it and all the things that made it an oppressive language. I wanted to sort of allow it to own up to itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Like, I don't know, it's definitely a process still in the making. No one writer can
Sure.
possibly like kind of come to grips with all that is horrible and all that is
Yes.
oppressive within even a single language. So I don't know. I'm like a little bit over ambitious for my skills.
I really appreciate your nostalgia. I think that's maybe a limiting word, but this idea of childhood and its beauty in its simplicity. A lot of the podcast is built on that. Even the Chills at Will podcast, the Chills at Will goes back to a Tobias Wolff short story where a lot of that is memory and nostalgia, and so much of that. Um, in writing about that in the thesis background, you write, quote, I believe that children are not fundamentally different from adults in terms of their experiential capabilities. I believe that childhood is not simply proto-adulthood, and therefore it should not be treated as childish, or meritless to serious art. The role of childhood is to act as a foundation to our lives. Aesthetically, we draw from it as the core, the taproot of experience, interpreting and reinterpreting our past, even as we reconstruct it through memory. I'm amazed that you have so much clarity at what I think is still a pretty young age, right? Um, what is it about childhood, about childhood as a whole that has really found its way into your writing?
Well, a lot of it is because so many of my interests and so many of my obsessions and things I gravitate towards have been, called out as childish or they've been labeled childish. Cartoons, like pretty colors, flowers, all these things. They've always been labeled with these negative words and they've been seen through the lens of heteronormativity. And part of the reason why I gravitate so much to them is because I am a childish person. I am a gay person. I love these things in a sort of way that is enthusiastic and totally sincere. And that makes me vulnerable. It makes everybody who is like me vulnerable. And so the language that comes into play, the name calling, the bullying, all of that comes from the language of domination, comes from the hierarchization of manly versus unmanly versus straight versus gay. And so I think that the reason why I'm so obsessed with childhood is because so much of my life I've been seeing evidence of how childhood gets used as an excuse for it not being valid, for the work of the creative artist to not be valid.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the times in my thesis, I'm writing in justification mode. I'm writing in defense mode. And so I'm trying to put up a defense using the mastery of academic language as much as I can. And so because I'm able to enter that language of the academic so well, and I'm able to put on that sort of disguise and pretend to be that sort of like authorial voice, I'm able to put together this sort of like professional sounding voice that basically is saying it's not childish to have a childhood.
Mm-hmm.
It's not childish to view childhood as being, worthy of art, worthy of artistic subject, and worthy of artistic elevation.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the reasons I feel that way is because one of the writers I read in the past, she quoted something like, anyone who has survived childhood has enough material to write for their
Yes.
entire life.
Yes.
I don't know who it was. I know that it was a woman, and like she basically said it best. I was kind of like racking my head as I was writing this thesis, just trying to find all these quotes I wanted in the thesis. But the whole thesis writing process is kind of crazy because you have to have documentation and citation for everything. It
Mm,
cannot be a messy document without, any sort of citation. And
right.
so I had to leave out a lot of stuff, and that makes me feel bad. But at the same time, I kind of recognize the value of having that sort of discipline and structure and sort of like institutionally approved like form that's been
Mhm.
set down to kind of like mash everything in. So instead of viewing the form of the thesis and the requirements of the thesis as an institutionally approved document as a cage, I kind of like to view it as a corset. It keeps
Mm.
all the flabby bits together.
That's a heck of a metaphor as well. I mentioned when you talked about like the heteronormativity and like this idea of cartoons and some of those being kind of being considered outside of what's acceptable. Like, I mean, I know. I guess I'm asking what is it about some of those pursuits that are looked down upon? Because I know that a lot of times, especially men, I should say boys, especially probably white boys, are allowed to get away with a lot of childish things, right? They talk about a lot of today, like a lot of, like Trump's sons, like they're called kids. They're 38 and 42 or whatever, you know what I mean? So I guess kind of what are some of those things that you felt were like that because of heteronormativity are okay for the heterosexual white boy and maybe not for, the gay kid, that kind of thing.
Honestly, it all comes down to the same thing. It's about control and domination. And so when we look at some of the things that are excused under the label boys will be boys,
Mm-hmm.
everything from sexual assault all the way to like immaturity in like just a general sense, the trope of the man child, all these things that show up in pop culture and in our real world reality, they're excused under the banner of boys will be boys because they
Yep.
support a sort of hegemonic order that, excuses white patriarchal power. And
Hmm.
so a lot of my writing is sort of like the undercurrent or the underlying politics and theories within it is that this should not be okay. I'm trying to talk back against that sort of excuse thing.
Sure.
And I'm trying to develop a sort of like anti man child sort of like persona.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the things that I love, a lot of the things that I celebrate have been traditionally derided as gay, as faggoty, as, childish, as dorky, as just being queer. And this is because identity is politics. Just
Hmm.
existing is a form of protest.
Mm-hmm.
And so once someone realizes this, they realize that it's within their best interest. It's within their instincts of survival to talk back against those kinds of discourse.
Mm-hmm.
That overall negative discourse that says it's wrong of you to love what you love, that it's wrong of you to exist and to love because you exist. All of that is something that I use my writing to talk back against.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is something that forms the sort of like counter or the opposite to what I want and what I love. And honestly, sometimes it gets a little bit much. Like to be writing this thesis, like right in the tail end of the Trump era, I mean, I feel like it's super surreal. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm amazed that I can think the things that I think and feel the way that I feel, like in what felt like such an unstable time. I
Right.
mean, I've seen plenty of like sort of media, especially like SNL and like late night comedy shows that sort of like exemplify exactly how I feel about living like underneath Trump's administration and sort of like everything it represents politically and culturally. All that feeling of like, oh, the conservatives won and the liberals like lost. And I just I don't know. It was always a surreal time, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not even over technically because we're still living so
Yes.
much in the consequences of it. So I really don't know. I definitely feel like my writing is trying to talk back against all those excuses made for immature
Mm-hmm.
and overpowered men. But at the same time, I feel there's not that much that separates, a person who's trying to control another from another person who's trying to get more control
Hmm.
over their own lives. So as much as I try to talk back, I also have to be careful not to talk down to others.
Hmm. So you're in talking back, you're saying, these interests, they're not frivolous, they're formative, they're what make adults into adults. There is not so much of a fine line. Don't cut this fine line between childhood and adulthood as if they're two different existences, right?
Yeah, because so much of our mainstream culture is about separating and categorizing the differences between the
Mm-hmm.
childish and the adult. And when you're the adult, you're legitimized, you're validated. Uh, you get to enjoy the things that you enjoy because they're adult interests. You get to exist the way you do because it's an adult existence. The child is always expected to mold themselves into the adult. Child
Mm-hmm.
is always expected to gradually move out of being what they are. And when you're a queer child, it's always a phase. Your identity itself, your very being, it's nothing more than a phase. You're going to eventually be erased, overwritten like a save file against what is going to come afterwards. And what will come afterwards is not going to be you. And that's the sort of threat that gets levied against you when you're born queer. When you're born not being the adult that society wants you to be.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. We can transition into the actual writing. We're going to look at a couple of your pieces in fairly good detail. In the thesis, you wrote about an inspiration from a classmate. I pick it up where it says, "quote I wrote thanks in part to a poem read aloud in class by a high school classmate of mine in 2010, who'd won a contest or something. Her poem was called The Dance Between Chaos and Order. It detailed the waltz between two beautifully anthropomorphized, that word, anthropomorphized. Anthrop.
Anthropomorphized.
Thank you. My daughter actually says that word. She's 5, and I can't say it. She says anthropomorphic figures who represented primordial cosmic forces. They were abstractions and deities, of course, yet at the same time believably human. Etc. Etc. You put nothing about her delivery or writing style was particularly amazing, and yet I was arrested. It felt like, to me, the whole class was. She had communicated something that was totally hers. I wanted that sort of creative autonomy for myself. Was there a eureka moment or moments where you said, or someone told you, like, you can do this? You are a heck of a writer. Your work is arresting in the same way as your classmates was.
Well, I wish that there kind of was, and I still kind of write in the hopes of, having that wish come true. But I feel like that moment was so memorable to me,
Mm-hmm.
particularly because she had everybody's attention, because she had the command over the entire classroom, including mine. And that moment was also a moment of pure like artistic envy because
Sure.
for me I've always wanted to have command over an audience like that. I've always wanted for everyone to see me at my most essential, me at my most creative. And so much of my writing I feel is the way it is because I'm constantly searching and seeking out that sort of moment.
Mm-hmm.
There was this one moment in the 12th grade where it was a classic slam, meaning that we would have to memorize a poem by a sort of like classical poet. That usually just meant someone who was published, somebody who was part of the canon.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would write a response poem. And so when I memorized my poem, which was Ways of Talking by Ha Jin, it was a relatively short and simple poem. And the response poem that I wrote was way longer and took a
Hmm.
far different route. And yet, at the same time, it's had the same sort of thematic concerns of being different from the rest of society, being different because one is an immigrant, because one is, just has a different identity from the rest of the mainstream. and it was just this long and overly sort of like worded poem. And yet it was at the same time kind of amazing because when I finished it, everyone in the audience, applauded. And to me, that moment was just so deafening
Mm.
to hear that sort of validation that I had been missing all my life. And I don't know, I guess that moment just sort of like made me addicted to poetry at then, because like here I am with a whole MFA and I'm still not, able to get over that moment.
Hmm. That's really cool though. That applause, that validation. That's so cool. Um, the origin of your thesis, besides the fact that you had to do a thesis for your MFA, California metaphysics, the title maybe, where did the inspiration or inspirations come from, or is that a 3 hour answer?
No, it's not. It's relatively simple. But yeah, like I got a little bit of like crap from the people who were reviewing my thesis because it's like, well, one of them was in charge of reviewing the content and to see whether there was anything that needed to be revised, and he found a lot of stuff. But basically, he was coming from a philosophy background, and here I am just using the word as poetically and with as much artistic license as I could, and he was like, yeah, you might need to read up on like Kant and Ovid and all these people. And I'm like, I don't have time for that. It's due in like a couple of weeks. And so like the name gave me a bit of trouble, but it really kind of emerged because like I'm a constant daydreamer.
Mm.
And for me, back in high school, I think it was the name of one of the spell books I wanted to write. Like I really wanted to like write spell books, like the traditional Western grimoires that I saw in the video games that
Ah.
I would play, and that later on in life I would research and kind of like find out their role in history.
Mm.
And a lot of these like so-called spell books, they weren't instruction manuals or anything. Like I always thought that books were kind of like the ones that were in Harry Potter. Like they were textbooks for budding wizards and witches. But in reality, the ones that we have here in reality in traditional Western culture are actually really like loose collections of notes, and they would
Mm.
detail spells, yes, but they would also detail like personal observations, and like so much of them was kind of a confluence of that particular individual. And when they were, written by multiple people, well, they were works of collaborative writing. And that to me, like connected back to the sort of pedagogy classes that I was taking and that, required from like my career. And so I would find all these connections between my personal interests, between my poetry, and the sort of things that I have to do as an adult, the things that I have to do as a functioning member of society. And
Mm-hmm.
like so much of my thesis, I'm proud of it because all these connections that I was making at that time has found their way somehow into the actual document. And so
Sure.
like if I ever do write like a full on like manuscript or a full on like collection of poetry, I want it to be just as like dense in meaning as
Mm-hmm.
what I managed to like crap out like after 4 years of study. Two.
You were talking about when you would do a poem, like a response poem, in response to that classic, you do an answer to that kind of thing. I'm wondering about the idea of the muse. I did a little dive into Kaguya, and like the myth, or the folk tale, if you will, all of its iterations over the years. Very interesting stuff. You do one of the poems in response to Van Landingham, directly in response to her poem. Um, I just wonder how much the idea of the muse plays into your own writing. Is that
I
something
mean,
is that something you seek out, or is it something kind of just comes out
it's
naturally?
definitely sort of contentious issue for me because so much of the muse emerges from like Greek oratorical like culture,
Mm,
and that necessarily means the woman must be silent while the man performs or creates the art. And to me, that dynamic has always kind of been present in the idea of the muse. The muse is always this sort of like passive object, or
mm,
this passive force of inspiration, while it's the male actor, the male auteur, or the male
mm-hmm,
author who performs and creates and has a voice. And as somebody who feels so different from that traditional male identity, I never really found my way into that sort of like concept.
Hmm.
And I know how much it shows up in my own work. Like so many like of these myths that I write in response to, so many of like the women whose poetry I write in response to, they would probably occupy a traditional like lens or traditional image of the muse. But for me, the muse has always been sort of like suspect category because
Mm.
it often meant the silence of the woman. It often meant the erasure or the passivity of the woman. And so, with specifically the Kaguya poem, like I wrote that in response to the animated film by Isao Takahata. And it was one of the most beautiful films I've ever watched. But not just because it was well animated and it was well drawn. It was beautiful because it didn't shy away from the despair that Kaguya felt. It didn't look away or avert its eyes from the harsh reality of what she was facing, which was, for me, this total erasure of herself.
Hmm.
From everywhere she looks, from nature to her own parents to the heavens themselves, the whole world wants her to disappear into herself. They want her to be a silent object of passivity. And in the end, that is what happens. But not until she's had her life, not until she's
Mm.
lived properly. And so, no matter how much, like, her parents love her, especially her father, no matter how much society showers her with gifts and benefits and praise, it can't escape from the fact that it is dooming her by erasing who she is,
Hmm.
by preventing her from becoming who she wants to be. And in the end of that movie, spoiler alert,
Hmm.
she ascends to heaven and her memories of life on earth are erased. And for me, that is one of the highest examples of tragedy because she's just a child. That's what she really is. She never even fully grows up to be a fully developed adult with autonomy
Hmm.
and the ability to choose for herself on her own. She's just forced to become this unfeeling, unknowing, and oblivious being who contains a sort of like sorrow that she can't even understand because even that knowledge has been taken from her. And so, yeah, that's why I kind of disagree with the concept of the muse. I'm kind of suspicious of it.
Sure. Yeah, in reading the reviews about the 2000, I think it was 2014 when Takahata made the movie. I don't know if I'm off by a year or so, maybe. The again, it's been done, thousands, hundreds of times, tens of, dozens of times, if you will. And the reviewers, the critics were saying what made it so good, and I think it was nominated for an Academy Award. Was, as you were saying, I'm interested. It's interesting to see that you recognize that and appreciated that. Was the fact that she was given agency in the movie. As you said, not as much as she would like, not wasn't able to live out the full life, etc., as an adult. But that does seem that it was different. In a lot of the other iterations, we didn't hear from her. We didn't know about her. And what Takahata did was give her a voice. So
Yeah, that made the tragedy all the more powerful because
exactly.
you recognize that she's a person with
Mm-hmm.
her own life and her own dreams and her own aspirations, and that potential is always there.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's this overwhelming silence that she's doomed to
Mm-hmm.
because of society, because of the way that we choose our world to be. And it's the worst.
Hmm. I don't know if it would be a good time for you, maybe if you wanted to read. I don't know if you wanted to read that poem,
Sure. Let's see
and
if I can
good
pull that
transition.
up. Okay, I've got the poem.
Go for it.
Ossified landscape with faceless girl, alternatively Kaguya. After Isao Takahata, his animated film, Princess Kaguya. This smile, which too is bone, becomes weightless as the moon. Bone too, in this weightless world, landscape of an interiority, far beyond the men who had chased after the elusive princess. until she begged the heavens for reprieve, and they mistook this to mean from all suffering in its myriad forms, and truth being what it was, merciless. They called her from the viewing pavilion, from her suitor's arms, weightless in waiting rooms, hovering needlessly in suspense for a soft footfall, down the hall, past the empty shuttle and loom, down hall, her parents' arms, weightless too, their grief, all encompassing as the moon, as this landscape, like a smile, which is bone now too, and those gods with so much blind grace in their eyes graced her with a mantle of oblivion, a crown of cold and precious stones. So much beauty in their weight, they erased the gaze of all who gazed upon her face, gazeless now, forgetful, already wiping away the last set, the final sweep of a three-part disconcert of her tears, a small bundle of misunderstood notes, this coda for pained life, tears. They waltzed off her face, faceless now, her tears wrought as they were, precious moon, low flowing moan from the truth, merciless thing of human anguish.
Thank you so much for reading that.
Oh, thank you.
I've been able to speak to a couple translators on the show. I've been able to speak to like a gentleman who's an audiobook narrator, and just the idea of like the interpreter, right? And Takahata is an interpreter of this film, or excuse me, of the storyline, right? It's called the oldest existing folktale of Japan, but he interprets it in his own way. People much smarter than I talking about his animation style is passionate and not as detail oriented to show the emotion, etc. But he interprets it. You interpret it in your poem. I just think that's so cool. There's the idea of Ecclesiastes in the Bible and onto Hemingway, etc. There's nothing new under the sun, but it's all in the way that you interpret it. I'm interested in the maybe two or three spots, including merciless thing at the end, where it's in parentheses. Is that like you or like the narrator kind of inserting his or her voice into it, or how did you see the parentheses?
The parentheses really is kind of like a tear in the poem because it's revealing in a sort of very declarative way the subtext underneath it. And so after you pull off all the covers, you take
Mhm.
off all the clothes, after you've torn off the surface, you get flesh, you get
Mm.
death, you get the truth. And
Mhm.
the truth is that, life is full of suffering, that her existence itself was full of suffering because
Mhm.
she was not allowed to exist, because she was not allowed to be who she was.
Sure.
And so for me, the parentheses is just a tiny little hole, a gap that I insert, and
Mhm.
then what fills it in is what I feel is underneath. It's
Mhm.
the water welling up from the ground after you dig a hole, after you plunge in the shovel. It's the tears that emerge.
Mm. Is it is it an analog to say that it would be like the fourth wall, like breaking the fourth wall?
Well, sort of, because the fourth wall is there invisibly. It's like glass. It separates us
Mm.
from the action on the page. But I mean more than just the fourth wall. Like when an interpreter interprets, when a cultural critic critiques,
Mhm.
they're really doing, what we in like English pedagogy see as like the primary methodology by which everything kind of gets critiqued. We close read. And
Mhm.
so when we close read, when we allow the surface of the text to become marred, when we open it up, when we scar it, when we just try to pry into it, and what we see underneath is always a reflection of ourselves. It's
Mhm.
never objective truth. And
Sure.
so by inserting a parentheses, you're not really, opening the poem up to objective like truth. You're opening it up to subjective truth.
Mm.
And so that's the function of the mirror or the sort of gap. What
Mhm.
you see reflects you. And so whatever it is that gets reflected, whatever it is that is you, that's your truth.
Mhm.
And oftentimes it's difficult to like sort of like make meaning out of all these things that get reflected back. I
Right.
suppose in this particular poem, the reason why I wrote it the way I did, the reason why I have that parentheses in there, is because I needed to have some kind of voice that interrupts the monotony, the sort of like flowing and
Mm-hmm.
effusive cadence that just doesn't stop until the end. Like
Sure.
I wanted an interruption. I wanted something to break up the flow.
Mm-hmm.
And because in the film itself, you see so much of the conclusion even before like the end
Mm-hmm.
because it's an old story,
Sure.
and like most old stories everybody already knows what's going to happen in the end and there's no changing it, not unless you want a completely different story. And so when I was watching the film knowing how it would end, you would see these moments of absolute beauty, like when she was walking out of her carriage onto the field, the large sakura tree was blooming. And that's was one of the, I guess I would term the money shots of the film.
Hmm.
It's the shot that was used in the trailer and screen caps, and it's her Kaguya kind of twirling underneath the sakura petals as they fell, and she would have just this expression of just pure joy and what some would argue would just be childish, innocent joy on her
Sure.
face. And like that's the joy of a person who is being who she is.
Mm-hmm.
And it will end in a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
And when you juxtapose everything that she could have been, everything that she was, with how she's going to end up, that's where you get the effect. That's where you get the aesthetics of the
Yeah.
film. And so my reaction then to that to that moment and everything that it would mean is what this poem is. It's
Mm-hmm.
me trying to take that feeling of watching her, knowing how it would end, and trying to translate it into a practice. What's really a sort of exercise in assonance and consonance.
Mm.
To me, that's all this poem really is. It's like
Mm.
my feelings plus poetic devices and trying struggling to use poetic device as well, and then coming out with what I have, and
Mm.
then some editing.
I think people of my generation, we grew up knowing like Jim Carrey is like a comic, genius, but like he was a comic guy. He was kind of a, Three Stooges type, kind of some cheap laughs, if you will, physical comedy. But he did a movie called The Eternal Sunshine of the
The
Spotless Mind.
spotless mind.
I
Yeah,
gotta think there's a connection there,
there is. That's
right?
one of my favorite movies actually,
What a great
because
movie.
like it's an amazing movie. I always begged my sister to watch it, and then she watched it, and then we both like sort of like fanned over it.
Yeah.
I guess that particular movie, I was never really that into Alexander Pope until I watched
Mm,
that movie, because that
mm,
movie is its own sort of like academic text. It's
sure.
so heady and sort of like a cerebral, and yet at the same
Right.
time so deeply emotional. And
Mm-hmm.
the way the surreal edits and the surreal imagery of that particular movie would kind of like make you understand the subjective truth and the difference between subjective truth and what we term to be reality.
Right.
It always reminds me that people do live in their own heads. People do have separate experiences of reality, and that separation between two people, no matter how close they might be, that itself is both tragic and beautiful.
Mm,
Because no matter how much you love someone, no matter how much you care for them, you can never truly know who they are. There's this fundamental loneliness that separates consciousnesses. And so, what I feel is so beautiful about these particular films, despite their tragedy, or perhaps because of their tragedy, is
mm,
because they so clearly elucidate you know, the pain of being alive, the pain of existing. And that's to be and that's to know that you're a person, to know that you're alive, and not
mm,
being able to share that with others.
mm-hmm. Wow. I was gonna my question was gonna be something simple like, have you seen it? I expect maybe you'd say no, right? That was an incredible movie. So many connections there. Maybe some of them subtle or not so subtle in the mind of the director. Now I'm interested in, I'm gonna go down that rabbit hole and see the connections. But yeah, you explained it very well. Yeah, that idea of thinking you know a person, how close you might be or might have been. Yeah, beautiful movie. So there's a shout out to those who who want to feel, right? And like you said, to think. It's very cerebral for sure. Some of the things that I picked up in that poem is you talk about like the technique of the actual writing. The repetition is very makes the poem better with ossified. This idea of the dryness, this fixed or rigid thing. Earlier, you talked a little bit about oblivion, and it makes more sense. Which I was kind of wondering in what way you meant that. If it was like a literal kind of almost like a nothingness or like an abyss, and it does seem to be like an erasure of love and emotion, and
Right, because
right.
that's what she's doomed to at the end of the
Mm-hmm.
movie. She's doomed to forget her life on Earth.
Right.
And oblivion has both of those meanings, to return to nothingness and to forget. And so much of the pain of that forgetting, the
Mm-hmm.
pain of that moment, it emerges because it's her identity that is cast into oblivion. As her memories of life are thrown into forgetfulness,
Mm.
her life itself and her identity, the person she became, gets cast into oblivion. And so when you have your memories erased like that, when you willingly give them up, as in the
Right.
case of like what's his name in the movie, the main characters,
I honestly don't even
like
remember his name. It's been so long.
Clementine
Okay,
and
Clementine's.
Jim Carrey's character,
Uh-huh.
they both willingly harm themselves. They
Sure.
literally liken the operation to brain damage,
Mm.
and they willingly cast their memories into oblivion. When you do that sort of thing, it's self erasure, and of course we self erase all the time. Freudian like psychologists, they call it repression.
Mm.
And so all of this erasure, whether it's socially approved or encouraged or not, is really a form of self harm. It's a
Yeah.
form of of giving into something larger than yourself, and not in like a good way, because so much of it means you lose who you are at your core.
Mm.
So much of it means losing something that is precious to you, so
Yeah.
much so that it ends up destroying who you are, leaving you incomplete as a person. And so, like Clementine and Joel, yeah, that's his name.
Joe. Okay.
He and her, it's implied in the movie that they have been in this cycle for a very long time. This is not their first time,
Mm-hmm.
meeting up with each other even after the operation. And so you have to kind of think of the history of their relationship as a constant cycle of loving and then forgetting, of hating and then forgetting,
Mm.
remembering, and all these things. It's a recursive cycle. It's like scar tissue slowly building up on their brains, and yet
Sure.
they can't forget or really lose their love for each other.
Yeah.
And so it's both beautiful and it's tragic. It's both, wonderfully alive and joyful, and yet at the same time intensely painful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess so much of what I'm attracted to as a poet, so much of what I want to bring out in my own poems, is that contrast between joy and
Sure.
pain, between tragedy and beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it means sort of recognizing how we hurt ourselves just by existing, how we hurt others and how others hurt us just by existing.
Yeah.
These seemingly ordinary things that we take for granted are seen as invitations to be hurt sometimes. And that is tragic because they shouldn't be.
Right. What you're saying makes me think of like multiple layers of dramatic irony because of oblivion, right? So like, is it Kaguya? Am I saying this? Am I stressing that correctly? Kaguya? The idea of Kaguya, like, those people who know what she doesn't know anymore, right? After the erasure, if you will, they know what she used to be like, and they feel for her. There's tragedy. You talked about tragedy and beauty. It's like there's tragedy because there was beauty. There's beauty because there was tragedy. The whole thing about we know whoever we is in the movie, watching Kaguya, watching Eternal. We know how great things were, and in that tension, there's a sadness there that she doesn't know, that he doesn't know,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I guess that tragedy emerges because we know how things could have been. We
Mm-hmm.
can sense
Exactly.
the
Exactly.
potential living underneath what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so Takahata himself, I think before he passed, he said he made a commentary on the film saying that it was a metaphor for the death of a small child. It was a metaphor for the death of a young girl dying too early.
Mm,
And so that's why, at the end, the parents are, mourning over the goneness, the absence of their
sure,
daughter.
sure.
And so when you reapproach the film in that way, in that when you approach it through that personal lens and you see it as mourning the death of somebody who's supposed to live,
Mm,
it develops its tragic dimension because you can sense that there was more life, there was more everything,
yes.
there was just she had more to gain. She had more to live through. And now none of it is going to matter in a way because
Hmm.
her life has ended prematurely. Like contrast that to what's that sci-fi movie with Jeremy Renner and it's about teaching aliens and
I
with
have not seen it, but I know what you're talking about. I'd recognize the name if I heard it.
but yeah, that particular film, whatever its title is based off of a Ted Chiang short story called Story of Your Life. And the film does things, I think, a little bit differently. But also, I guess, spoiler warning again, the whole point of that movie is learning how to approach time and tragedy. Because her daughter is doomed to die. Her
Mm,
daughter is doomed to develop cancer and to die before her time, or at least from a sort of normative view, she dies before her time. But once the main character kind of approaches her, the events of her future as if they were the events of her past,
mm,
once she learns to develop a more recursive view of time, that's when she develops the perspective to understand the tragedy that she will encounter. And so she chooses to have this child, even knowing its fate, even knowing that
mm.
both she and her are doomed to end their relationship in tragedy. And when you choose to do that, obviously you have a sort of foreknowledge or sort of like knowledge that you are willing to go through it. So what makes it worth the risk? What makes it worth the pain?
Hmm.
And discovering that is, I guess, the beauty of it. The beauty isn't so much inherent to the tragedy as it is something that emerges while negotiating, while dealing with
Right,
tragedy.
right. So the film was called Arrival.
There we go.
That the one? There it is.
Yeah, there we go. The arrival, because the aliens arrive and everything changes.
Towards the end of the poem Ossified Landscape, you write, about Kaguya, of course. Uh, Erase the gaze of all who gazed upon her face, gazeless now, forgetful, already wiping away the last set, the final suite of a three-part, this concert of her tears, a small bundle of misunderstood notes, this coda for a pained life. There's definitely a theme or a that runs throughout, or the motif of being ephemeral, I guess, of this life, right? This of happiness, youth, all these things being fleeting. Life, I guess you might even say, being fleeting or ephemeral. Am I reading that correctly?
I mean, yeah, because it's obviously a central like observation that the ancient Japanese had used for centuries. Like
Mm,
it's particularly common to a lot of haiku, a lot of Heian or Heian era like poetry,
mm,
the ephemerality of life, the short-livedness. But we wouldn't be revisiting this theme, or we wouldn't find it so useful unless we saw that it was applicable to all sorts of contexts and situations.
sure.
And so when we look particularly at Kaguya and the way it negotiates with the ephemerality of life, the way it like exemplifies it, we see that the ephemerality of life is not the way it is because things happen to be that way. After all, times change. Medicine develops, human lives grow in life expectancy.
Sure.
What really it stays the same is our constant, sort of like self harm, our constant self sabotages,
Mm,
our inability to get away from, you know, this recursive habit of oppressing the people need who need it the least,
mm,
just forcing people to change and not allowing them to be themselves. regardless of how noble or how, bright they are, because this is the way things have to be in our mind, in our
Mm,
societal ideology. And so the tragedy of the short livedness, the ephemerality of life, stays the same. It's no longer because of natural causes. We're recognizing that the tragedy is with ourselves.
mm,
Tragedy is with what we choose to continue to do. And the reason why we still find the death of this young woman still so tragic is because we know we could have changed and we could have prevented it by being different,
hmm
but we weren't. And so now we're here again, faced with the reality of who we are and what we've caused.
mm. It's funny. I taught a book years back, a great book. It's called Across 100 Mountains by Reina Grande. And, one of the characters' last names is Luna, which of course is moon. And there's this idea of like, the two parts of humanity, other sides of it. And I actually got a chance to ask the author, and I said, was that purposeful to name him Luna, about changing? And she's like, no, it's just a good name. Right. But, obviously in the poem, excuse me, in the story of the princess, the moon is a literal thing, part of the storyline, but you use it often. Weightless says the moon, use it at least two or three times. Is is the moon used by you as, again, that sort of ephemeral nature of things, how it's changing? What were you going for with the moon and the usage?
I think for me, what the moon represents is this other place, like Wonderland was for Alice, or how Eden was for Adam and Eve. What the moon represents is both nostalgia for a place that never existed and a sort of longing to be away. And so obviously, Kaguya has close connections to the story of the Moon Lady in Chinese mythology. And the reason she had to depart from her lover at the end was because, I forget, but basically they just couldn't be together. And
Mm,
so many of these Asian myths and Asian folklores are about the pain of separation. And so these other places, these otherworldly places, they become, you know, a site for our longing to coalesce.
mm,
Nowadays, we know what the surface of the moon looks like. We have photographs. Neil Armstrong was there, he planted a flag, yay,
mhm,
we won the space race. And so these places that were originally only a part of human fantasy that we can only view from a distance are becoming more and more accessible because of our scientific progress. What remains, however, in terms of our cultural consciousness, is the tendency to project, to force our, most painful emotions onto something else and have that inhabit or take on our emotions. And
mm,
so that's what the moon kind of becomes. It becomes the place where the absent one goes to. It becomes the place of death, the place you can never reach. And so when we think about that place that we can never reach, the way it plays into the paradise myth in Western culture and the moon myth in Eastern cultures, what the other place really represents, a place beyond death, is a place of potential where our ideas of what could have been can go, and where they can fulfill themselves in peace, where our wishes and our longings for a complete life, for a real life, for a true relationship, that's where all these wishes and longings go to, so that they can have their complete and non-partial existence.
mm,
So there's this poem that's super long. It's like almost a mini epic by Dana Smith. And he writes in the Black Lives Matter tradition, mourning deaths of young black men who were shot by the police. In this poem entitled Summer Somewhere, he imagines an alternate version of heaven where these dead boys go to, where they can be themselves. And so this paradise myth, this other place, it becomes a place where the incomplete lives of tragic figures can become complete.
mm,
And that's where like the beauty and the tragedy are confronted and created.
mm.
That's where we truly confront the reality of social wrong, of social injustice. And that's how we come to grips with our own sort of like social fears and our collective anxieties
Mm.
about death and injustice and wrongdoing.
Very interesting. I thought we could finish with C is for California, which is a different type of poem in many ways than the one we just dealt with. But picking up on paradise, which you were talking about a bit. I mean, California is paradise. California is Hollywood, but California is also, neglected homeless people. California is, the beginnings of Carl's Jr. and all these, restaurants and entrepreneurship. It's also the home of, the birthplace of many like white supremacist groups and, all of these paradoxes, if you will, all these things that are in opposition. Um, I wanted to discuss that one a bit, if you wouldn't mind. And
Sure, absolutely.
again, it's for me to read it is not as good as if you wouldn't mind reading it. That'd be great.
Okay, sure. C is for California. There's not enough room on this page to contain your massive sunsets and your just as massive ego. You are beautiful the way a summer beach full of heteronormative hot babes is beautiful. You are full of it. I, too, am full of you, am through with your gorgeous twilight and its paradisiacal meltwater colors. I am through with your sky as it golden hairs it through the day we lost our dog. I still had to go to work. Your mountains filled with lapis blue the week my grandfather found out I was gay and only held his tongue because it was already chained by his illiteracy and old age. Your wildflowers tearing forestries to pieces. The year my grandmother was on dialysis died, and I found out my mother and her had fought over the lateness of Thanksgiving turkey, and my father refused to take mom's side, didn't even hold her when it was over. When it was over. Closer to the blade of divorce as they were, as the 2008 financial crisis rolled through my middle school years, demolishing our restaurant and our confidence, my father's in his money, my mother's in herself and her family, and mine and my parents, who were suddenly not invincible, as flawed as crushed diamond, and the sun was flowery, summery, autumnal, and wintry, all through the impermeable years, the impenetrable seasons. So here's my elegy. Here's my praise poem. Oh, to California, bless your heart, you're goddamn right, the way the sky melted in the hot summer air. As the cop told me to sit on the baked concrete sidewalk, and my father tried to convince him to evict me because I refused to lift the rest of the bedpost we were moving. Also, a new tenant could arrive to be evicted over something as small as an eye. And I was alone in this sky, and I was alone in heaven without a God, in a garden without divine origin, in a body that could not be permissible without first being unhoused, dismissed, unfettered, decommissioned, falsified, lied to, counterfeited, decomposed, objectified, reorientated, interpreted, analyzed. I can write 100 verbs strong enough to bench press at Muscle Beach with all the bodybuilders and their shining workloads. But my work is in facing my home and calling it that, and refusing to unname it. There is not enough room on this page to give your beauty and its indifference a name. But wait, I, no, I got nothing.
Thank you so much for reading that.
Thank you for
What an
listening.
incredible. What were you saying?
Well, thank you for listening.
Oh, of course. I would almost say that the last couple lines where you write, but my work is in facing my home and calling it that and refusing to unname it. I almost feel like that's representative of the work of a poet just in general.
Yeah,
Right? I
kind
mean,
of. Yeah.
right? I mean, maybe talking more specifically about California but I always feel like the great literature is both very specific and also universal. You talk about personal things that happen to you, not necessarily names, but years and, very specific things. And it's also about California as a whole. It's also universal about the paradox of this beautiful place that has so much pain. The incredible writing of a heaven without a God. I don't know if those are adjectives or verbs, participles, I guess. That list you have of unhoused, dismissed, unfettered. There's something about that about that pace, that cadence that very much draws in the reader or the listener. And then I don't feel like I'm cheating here because I read a little bit of your explanation. The falling at the end, the inability to put adjectives to it, the inability to give it a name when it was so passionate and effusive, especially in those ones that lead up to it. So it's really cool to hear you read it, and the speed and the pace, and then you know, not enough room. But wait, no, I got nothing. I just, that's such an incredible ending, and that shift in tone or pace and all of that. How did this poem come together? Because there's so many interesting images. There's so much, I guess, reflection, if you will, personal and more reflection on society as a whole, but also very relatable in many ways, which I'll talk about in a second. But how did the poem come to you?
Well, I mean, one of my professors was Professor Charles Webb, and he's kind of like, I guess, notable for being one of the editors of the stand-up poetry anthology.
Okay.
And so, kind of being under his tutelage and being, having the sort of like high school experience that I had with Miss Burkhardt, like all of it sort of like connected me a little tangentially to the
Mm-hmm.
stand-up poetry scene. And although I was never, I never went beyond like the second round of like the regional or district like contests. I have always sort of like had this connection with stand-up poetry. And so I'm really borrowing from the stand-up poetry like tradition here.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of the stand-up poetry tradition is it's a very clear distinction between poetry that was written for the page
Sure.
versus poetry that was written for the stage. And so with stage poetry, with stand-up poetry, you have to deliver. You have to, assert yourself. You have to have a voice. Because so much of stand-up poetry is about providing a platform for those who traditionally don't have voices, for those who have not been validated. And so you must assert yourself. And that vocal tradition, that oracular tradition, is something that is deeply powerful, and it enables you to have a voice and to give voice to some of the pain that you are experiencing as an individual, as a
Mm-hmm.
minority, as a person of color, as someone whose identity is always at risk for erasure.
Mm.
But at the same time, I'm also a sort of like traditional academic kind of poet. After all, I'm, following in the tradition of countless poets of like teaching after, writing, of kind of like allowing the institution
Hmm.
of the university to, help provide for me, while at the same time engaging in the sort of like the counterculture against that sort of like academic tradition. And
Mm-hmm.
so you have two different traditions kind of like fighting it out here, one between the academic and one between the stand up. And so that ending really emerges as a sort of like confluence of the two.
Mm-hmm.
The specific technique of like leaving a gap or leaving things unsaid, aporia, which comes from the Greek oratorical tradition of like saying it but not really saying it. Should I name all the different ways that you the other are flawed? Sure, I could do that. I could say this, I could say that, but I'm not going to.
Mm.
That form of aporia where you say everything that the gap is supposed to contain.
Sure.
That for me is one of the like it took a long time for me to really learn how that worked as a sort of like rhetorical device and also as a lens for analysis. So
Mm-hmm.
much of our history, so much of our culture is one that is perforated with gaps, and it comes from a specifically Marxist tradition of analyzing and seeing gaps in history
Mm.
as being worthy and of being recognizable as subjects of critique, as
Mm.
subjects of analysis. And
Mm-hmm.
so when this poem emerges, part of it is wanting to be able to talk back, wanting to be able to state and sort of describe the experience and the pains that I went through. And yet at the same time, wanting to sort of like join it up with the rest of the more valid parts of myself,
Mm.
and by extension validating all of me as a whole. So not simply saying that I'm different and I'm other and I will inhabit this role of the other. It's not simply stating I am, part of the mainstream. I know all the tools. I am a valid poet, but it's occupying what I feel is the most important place a poet can occupy, the space in between, the
Hmm.
liminal. And
Hmm.
so that's what I feel makes the most successful poem, of being able to occupy not just one position, but in between positions, and really sort of asserting your voice within that place of in betweenness.
Wow. Very well stated. You talked earlier about imagery and, of course, images, and I will leave this poem with many images, but the images of, the day we lost our dog, I still had to go to work. The beautiful nature that you describe, I'll never forget. In the day that I learned that my beloved grandmother had passed away, my grandma had passed away, and it was like, why is the sun shining? Don't people know? Don't the gods, doesn't God know? Like that, and you describe some traumatic or troublesome or tough days and issues, again juxtaposed against this beautiful, the beautiful mountains, the wildflowers, and all of that. That is part is, I think, is very relatable for many people who read that.
Yeah. I wrote this poem partly out of a suggestion from my teacher to write a series of poets alphabets. And
Mm.
I guess once I hit the letter C, because I started from the beginning of the alphabet and then I hit the letter C, this poem kind of emerged and the first draft of it kind of like solidified. And it was that poem, it was at that moment that I kind of realized, oh, I got a lot of pent up feelings about California.
Mm.
And a lot of it has to do with what you mentioned before, like having gone through grief, having gone through a period of mourning, being in the beginnings of mourning, and then seeing how nature is still just wildly beautiful, and that tonal clash, that contrast between how we feel and how the world is. And then you realize at that moment that a lot of the times we want to engage in what is traditionally called the pathetic fallacy, which is, we see nature as reflecting or the environment as
Mm.
reflecting our internal state of the mind.
Mhm.
Like the clouds cried when, my grandmother died. And that's what we want in our hearts. But the reality is nature is indifferent.
Yep.
So I go back to like Robert Frost whenever I think about this poem because so much of his work was in elucidating the way the natural world feels so indifferent, so alien to
Mhm.
human consciousness, and
Mhm.
how human consciousness is just so endlessly immature and full of longing because of how it desires for the natural world to not simply be subjugated, but to empathize with the human subject,
Sure.
which it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this poem, and I guess one of the reasons why it works is because there's this natural world that functions as the environment, as the stage for, the emotions to play out.
Mhm.
And it just does not cooperate. It refuses to be anything less than itself. And what it is, it's beautiful and yet totally indifferent.
No doubt about it. I'm reminded of "There Will Come Soft Rains," Ray Bradbury. You familiar with that one?
No, but he is, a central figure in my own writing.
No doubt. And I mean, within that, I'm forgetting that there's a poem within that story that is basically, it's called "There Will Come Soft Rains," and it's the idea that the the earth will, the birds, the sun, nature will continue much longer than we will. And like you talked about, the indifference of nature. When again, we want
Yeah.
to we want to assign emotions, if you will, or that kind of things, like just indifferent in its most literal definition, where it doesn't care either way. Like it doesn't, so um whether, this, I'm interested to know what this collection, this thesis, which was done, like you said, kind of in the rigid, and I don't mean that in a negative way, the rigid, university way, or the MFA program. There's so much goodness and greatness in here. There's so many themes that are relatable, universal, specific. The tone, the changes, the juxtaposition, all of the above. what are you going to do with it? Or, is there a collection? Is there a chapbook in the future? What are my It's a long-winded way of saying, what are some future projects for you?
I honestly don't know because like I'm still honestly super wiped out from writing this
I
like
bet.
thesis, and that's even after like nearly a whole year of being on break from it. But then
Mm.
again, I don't feel bad about that because that break was in the middle of a global pandemic, which I
Yes,
still
yes.
resent the crap out of because
Uh,
like,
you and
oh,
me, you and me. I don't think we're the only
like
ones. Yeah.
if I'm going to write a chapbook or another manuscript, how am I going to write it without, keeping acknowledging the pandemic? How am I going to
Mm.
write anything now without
Mm.
acknowledging like this moment in my life, in our lives, in our collective like
Yeah.
history now? Because everything changed,
Yep.
and like it wasn't it wasn't something that factored into this thesis except for like when I was actually completing it. So it very much factored into like the physical production of it. So like I don't know. I got a bunch of extra time because of the pandemic. And I also got a bunch of other stuff. So in terms of future projects, I really don't know.
Yeah.
Because like the pandemic has put everything on hold. And it
Hmm.
and it still continues to put a lot of things on hold.
Yeah.
I remember thinking like when I finished my thesis, now I can get a job, and that never really panned out. Like I was always planning on getting sort of like an adjunct professorship, after my thesis, after my MFA. And I'm still working hard to try to get my foot in the door when it comes to like community college.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm not sure because
Mm.
I waited a whole like semester, and a lot of it was just spent like this idle wishing that
Mm.
was not going to work out.
Hmm.
And so I resolved myself at the beginning of this year to be more proactive, to try to get more positions and try to apply to more positions. And so I guess the short answer is I'm focusing on my career right now, and I don't know if I'm going to have enough time for future writing. For
Sure.
now, I'm just going to have to like depend on these poems and depend on what I've written so far to keep me going. I
Yeah.
do have poems that are still in the works.
I
I
bet.
actually wrote what I feel is a really great poem after the George Floyd protest,
Mm.
and I showed that to a couple people in my writing circle, and I'm hoping to get that published somewhere, but as of now, I've submitted to a couple of places,
Mm.
and they already said no.
Yeah.
So here's to hoping for the next place.
Yeah. Well, again, hopefully this is a snapshot of, I can say that I knew you back when. The work is too good to lay fallow. So I hope, obviously up to you, but I hope that in some way it's published in pieces or as a whole, or, in addition to some of the things you've written during the pandemic. But just really enjoyed talking to you. I think we kind of solved the problems of the world pretty much, no? So like, just
I
kind of
wish.
done, So we're done for the rest of the day at least, right? No, but
Uh-huh.
I really enjoyed reading your work, and appreciated hearing you read your own, and talking about some of the background. So thanks so much for your time, and great luck in the future.
Oh, thank you. And great luck to you too.
Really appreciate that. And again, I'll make sure to link some of your performance and the thesis as well, so that others can enjoy just like I have. Thank you for listening to episode 60 of the Chills at Will podcast with Andrew Liu. You can now subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Please leave me a 5-star review. You can also ask for the podcast by name using Alexa. Find it on Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter, where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation, and I'd love for your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look at an often ignored art form. The intro song for the Chills at Will podcast is Wind Down, and the other song played on the episode is Hoops. Both instrumental versions are used through archesaudio.com, and Hoops instrumental is by Matt Weidauer. For now, thanks again for listening, and I hope that these quarantine days bring you texts by writers with mad skills like Andrew Liu, whose California metaphysics gives you chills at will.